The little black girl knocked at the desert outpost, crying her mother's bag was taken by unknown drivers. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's begin. I know what you're thinking. Who are these men and what do they want? But there's one thing you can be sure of. Jake and his crew don't just ride motorcycles. They have a code. And it's about loyalty, honor, and protecting those who can't protect themselves. As the engines roared to life, the dust cloud billowed behind them, and the bikers sped into the desert. The sun was setting fast, casting long shadows over the cracked, arid earth. The road ahead was desolate, stretching endlessly in the fading light. The little girl, clutching her arms tightly to her chest, felt a glimmer of hope spark inside her. For the first time in hours, she wasn't alone. These men weren't just bikers. They were a family, bound together by something deeper than just the open road. They were going to help her. "We'll get your mom back, I promise," Jake said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead. The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and gratitude. She had no idea who these men were, but they were her only hope now. The desert was cold at night, and the silence was thick, only broken by the roar of engines and the occasional crackle of the radio. Jake, the leader of the group, was a man with years of experience, on the road, in battles, and in life. He knew how to lead a crew, how to read the situation, and most importantly, he knew when things didn't feel right. And right now, something didn't feel right. The little girl's story wasn't adding up. "Keep your eyes peeled," Jake said, his voice calm but firm, speaking into the intercom of his helmet. "This might not be just a simple robbery. There's something more here." One of the bikers, Big Rick, a massive man with a shaved head and tattoos covering every inch of his arms, grunted in agreement. "Yeah, I don't like it either," he muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "People don't just take kids for a bag." Jake didn't respond immediately, his focus on the road. The further they rode, the more his thoughts darkened. The Serpents. He had a bad feeling that they were involved. The Serpents were a gang known for their shady dealings, their ties to human trafficking, and their ruthless ways. If they were behind this, it would be more than just a kidnapping. It would be a fight. The miles stretched on as they rode deeper into the desert. The girl's name was Aisha, and she had been just trying to survive, just trying to get her mother back. But now, she was riding with a group of bikers who were ready to risk it all for a promise they had made to a little girl. The desert seemed endless, and the night air grew colder with every mile. They finally reached a small, rundown motel just outside of town. The headlights of the bikes cast an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. Jake signaled for the group to stop. "Let's take a look around," he said. "Keep it quiet." The group split up, spreading out in pairs to check the area. Aisha stayed close to Jake, her eyes darting nervously around. She had no idea what to expect next, but she trusted Jake and his crew. They weren't just bikers, they were protectors. The motel was eerily quiet. The flickering neon sign outside buzzed faintly, and the wind whistled through the broken windows. Inside, the smell of stale air and old carpet mixed with the faint scent of cigarettes and spilled beer. Jake knocked on the door of the room where they suspected the men had been hiding. He wasn't sure what they'd find, but he knew they needed answers. A voice from inside called out, "Who is it?" Jake took a deep breath, then spoke. "We're just here for some answers," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Open the door." A tense silence followed. Then, the door creaked open slightly. Jake's hand hovered near the grip of his leather jacket, just in case things went south. But it didn't. The door swung open, revealing a man with dark eyes and a cold demeanor. He didn't look surprised, but he wasn't exactly welcoming either. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Jake didn't hesitate. "Where's the girl's mother?" he demanded. "She's the one we're here for." The man didn't respond immediately, but the way his eyes flicked to the back of the room told Jake everything he needed to know. Without another word, Jake stepped forward, pushing the door open wider. Inside, a small group of men stood around a table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting in the middle. One man, wearing a snake tattoo on his neck, smirked when he saw Jake. You're in the wrong place, friend, he sneered. This isn't your fight. Jake didn't flinch. It is now, he said, his voice cold. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the tension thickening as the bikers filed in behind him, taking strategic positions around the room. The man with the snake tattoo stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. You don't know who you're messing with. I know exactly who I'm messing with, Jake shot back. Now, where's the girl's mother? The standoff lasted a few seconds longer, before the man finally stepped back, a sly grin spreading across his face. You want answers? You're going to have to earn them, he said. You'll have to come find her. Jake's heart raced. He wasn't about to let this go, not when a little girl's life was at stake. Then we'll find her, he said, his eyes hard with determination. The chase had only just begun. I know you're wondering what happens next. The tension in the air was thick as Jake and his crew stood facing the men inside the motel room, their presence a silent declaration that things were about to change. The man with the snake tattoo leaned back, his smirk never faltering, but Jake could see the shift in his eyes. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. The Serpents were known for their ruthlessness, but Jake wasn't about to back down. He stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of 1,000 miles ridden for moments like this. You're going to tell me where she is, or you'll regret it, Jake said, the words hanging heavy in the air. The room fell silent. The man with the snake tattoo glanced at his companions, all of them standing tense, waiting for the next move. Jake didn't flinch, his eyes locked on the man who had the answers. You think I'm afraid of you? The man with the snake tattoo sneered. I've seen guys like you before, loud, brash, but in the end, you walk away with nothing. Jake's hand moved to his side, his fingers brushing the worn leather of his jacket, the one that marked him as the leader of the Thunder Riders. He had seen plenty in his day, deaths, betrayals, wars, but there was one thing he always stood by. He protected the innocent. And this little girl, Aisha, was as innocent as they came. You don't get it, Jake said, his voice dropping to a low growl. I don't care about you, your gang, or your threats. But you're messing with a child. And that's where I draw the line. A flicker of uncertainty flashed across the face of the man with the snake tattoo. He didn't move, but Jake could tell he was thinking. A small advantage. Jake didn't waste it. Where is she? Jake repeated, his voice colder now. The man hesitated, then motioned to the back of the room, where a door was slightly ajar. She's back there. But you won't like what you find, he warned. Jake didn't need to hear more. He turned to his crew. Stay sharp, he said, and with that, he moved towards the door. The tension was unbearable as Jake pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room that smelled of old smoke and regret. And there, lying on the floor, was Aisha's mother, unconscious, pale, and battered. The sight struck Jake like a punch to the gut. His instincts kicked in. He rushed to her side, kneeling down to check her pulse. It was weak, but she was alive. We need to get her out of here, Jake muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Now, the bikers moved quickly, helping the woman onto one of their bikes, ready to get her to safety. But as they made their way out, one of the Serpents stepped forward, blocking the door. You think you're just going to walk away with her? He asked, his voice full of venom. Jake stepped up, his jaw set in determination. Yes, he said simply. We are. The biker didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, but before he could make a move, Jake was already there, his hand gripping the man's arm and twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. The biker yelped in pain, but Jake didn't release him. You don't want to do this, Jake said, his voice cold as ice. You're outnumbered, and you know it. The room was filled with silence as the other bikers closed in, their eyes hard. It was clear. They weren't leaving without Aisha's mother, and they weren't going to let anyone stand in their way. The Serpent took a step back, fear creeping into his eyes. You're making a big mistake, he warned. Jake didn't reply. He simply nodded to his crew, and with one final push, they made their way out of the motel and onto the road. Aisha's mother was safe for now, but Jake knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The desert stretched out before them as the bikers sped through the night, the lights of the city in the distance. But even as they rode, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Serpents weren't done with them, and he knew they'd be back. But Jake and his crew weren't the kind to run. They were ready for whatever came next. As they rode through the darkened desert, Aisha clung to Jake's side, her small body trembling with fear and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. Jake nodded, his face softening just slightly. "You're safe now. We'll make sure of it." The miles passed slowly, but for the first time that day, there was a sense of peace. For now, they had won. But Jake knew the battle wasn't over. "Not yet. I know you're all wondering how this story will unfold next." The journey was far from over, and every mile felt heavier than the last. With Aisha's mother now safe on the back of one of the bikes, Jake and his crew rode on through the vast, unforgiving desert. The night was cold, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked ground. The road stretched endlessly ahead of them, but Jake knew this wasn't just a ride home. It was a race against time, and the Serpents were closing in fast. The sound of roaring engines cut through the stillness of the desert night. As they sped down the narrow highway, the headlights illuminated the road ahead, and the harsh desert wind whipped past them. The bikers were focused, their eyes scanning every corner, every darkened stretch of road for any sign of trouble. Aisha clung tightly to Jake, her small body still trembling from the ordeal she had just gone through. Her mother was still unconscious, but she was stable for now. Jake had promised her that they would get her mother to safety, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The Serpents were a dangerous gang, and they wouldn't let this go. Jake glanced in his rearview mirror, scanning the distance behind them. The dark silhouette of a car had appeared far in the distance, just a tiny speck of light on the horizon. But in the desert, even the smallest light could be a signal of something much bigger. "We've got company," Jake muttered into his intercom, his voice steady but urgent. "Stay alert." The bikers immediately fell into formation, their bikes roaring as they moved together like a pack, united and determined. Jake's instincts were sharp, and he could feel the tension in the air. The road ahead felt like a ticking clock, the sound of their engines the only thing keeping time. The car behind them was getting closer. Jake could see the headlights growing larger, the silhouette of the vehicle becoming clearer. It wasn't just a car, it was a truck, and it was gaining on them fast. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Don't let them get close," Jake said. "Stay tight." The bikers responded without hesitation, their machines revving as they sped up, pushing their bikes harder to maintain the distance between them and the truck. The desert around them seemed to blur as they accelerated, the only sound the thunderous roar of their engines and the wind rushing past them. The truck behind them didn't slow down. In fact, it sped up, now only a few hundred yards behind. Jake's heart raced. He knew this was it. The Serpents weren't going to let them just ride away. They were coming for blood. "We need to lose them," Jake said. "Make a left up ahead, then we cut through the wash." "It's the only way." The bikers nodded, understanding the plan. They veered left, the tires of their bikes kicking up dust as they turned off the main road. And into the wash, a dry riverbed that ran through the heart of the desert. The wash was narrow, winding, and full of loose rocks, but it would give them the cover they needed. The truck followed them, its headlights cutting through the darkness, but the road was too tight, the terrain too rough for it to follow at full speed. Jake could feel the shift in momentum. They had gained a few precious seconds, but the truck was still behind them, relentless. The sound of the truck's engine rumbled through the desert like a storm, but it was no match for the nimbleness of the motorcycles as they weaved through the wash, the riders expertly navigating the jagged rocks and sharp turns. Aisha, still clutching Jake's side, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake glanced down at her, his expression softening just slightly. "We're going to be fine," he said, trying to reassure her. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The Serpents were persistent, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And Jake wasn't about to let them take Aisha's mother back. They had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The wash twisted and turned, and just ahead, Jake saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. They were getting closer to the outskirts of town. But before they could reach it, a sudden flash of headlights appeared from behind a large boulder, and a second truck emerged, blocking their path. The bikers skidded to a halt, their tires grinding against the sand. The second truck was parked sideways, blocking the entire wash, its engine idling as the headlights blazed. "Looks like we're not alone," Big Rick muttered, his hand instinctively going to the grip of his bike. Jake's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out. The trucks were closing in, and the bikers were surrounded. But Jake wasn't about to give up. He turned to his crew, his voice steady and resolute. "Hold your ground," he said. "We're not going anywhere without Aisha's mom." The bikers positioned themselves, their bikes roaring to life as they prepared for the standoff. It was a fight they knew was coming, but they weren't going down without a fight. Aisha looked up at Jake, her face filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Please, don't let them take her," she whispered. Jake looked down at her, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll make sure they don't," he said. And with that, the standoff began. I know the tension is building up now. With both trucks blocking the narrow wash, Jake and his crew had no escape. They were trapped. The engines of the bikes roared, the sound echoing through the dry riverbed, but the trucks were positioned perfectly to cut off any route of escape. Jake's eyes scanned the area, his mind calculating every possibility. The Serpents had them cornered, but Jake wasn't the type to back down. He was a man of action, and he wasn't about to let a bunch of thugs dictate the outcome. "Get ready," Jake said, his voice low and steady, a calm before the storm. "We fight our way out if we have to." The bikers exchanged determined glances. They were ready. They had been through worse. This was just another test, and they weren't going to fail. The truck's engines revved in unison, and the headlights flooded the wash, making it feel like midday instead of the dead of night. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and dust, the oppressive heat of the desert now mixing with the adrenaline. Aisha, still clutching Jake's side, looked up at him, her small face pale with fear. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Jake knelt down to her level, his expression softening just a bit. "We're going to be okay," he reassured her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "We're not going anywhere without your mom." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The crew knew what was at stake. A fight was coming, and they had to be prepared. "Everyone on my lead," Jake ordered. "We take them down, one by one. We're not leaving anyone behind." He signaled to his crew, and the bikers moved into position, their engines rumbling like a pack of wolves preparing to pounce. The two trucks stood in their way, but the bikers weren't intimidated. They were used to danger. They had stared death in the face more times than they could count. This was just another battle. The first Serpent made a move, stepping out from behind the truck, a long knife gleaming in his hand. He was tall, with a menacing look in his eyes, and he didn't hesitate as he started walking toward the bikers. But Jake was faster. Before the man could get close, Jake revved his engine and sped toward him, swerving around the truck in a flash. The biker with the knife barely had time to react as Jake kicked his foot out, knocking the knife out of his hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. The fight had begun. The Serpents rushed in, but the bikers were ready. Big Rick swung his fists like hammers, knocking one of the men back with a powerful blow. Another biker, Phantom, maneuvered expertly, taking down two of the Serpents with well-placed kicks. It was chaos, a blur of leather and steel. Aisha clung to Jake's side, her small body trembling as the sounds of the fight filled the air. She had never seen anything like this before, but she wasn't scared of the bikers. They were her protectors. The Serpents fought back hard, but they were no match for Jake and his crew. The bikers moved with precision, working as a team, their movements calculated. Jake was everywhere at once, his focus unshakable. He was in the thick of it, his hands steady on the handlebars as he knocked another Serpent off his feet. But even as the bikers were taking control, Jake knew this wouldn't be over until the Serpents were dealt with. The leader of the Serpents, a man known as Snake, stepped out from the second truck, his cold eyes scanning the chaos. He had a gun in his hand, and he wasn't afraid to use it. The bikers paused, sensing the danger. "Enough," Snake shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. He raised the gun, pointing it directly at Jake. For a split second, everything froze. The air was thick with tension, the sound of engines and shouting replaced by the ominous click of the gun's hammer. Aisha's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. But Jake didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He knew the stakes, and he knew he couldn't let Snake win. With a swift motion, Jake pulled out his own gun, pointing it at Snake with deadly accuracy. "You don't want to do this," Jake said, his voice cold and unwavering. Snake looked at Jake, then down at the gun end. His hand, The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, but in the end, Snake dropped his weapon, his hands raised in surrender. "This isn't over," Snake growled, but the fight had already been won. The bikers quickly subdued the rest of the Serpents, making sure they wouldn't cause any more trouble. Jake turned to Aisha, his eyes softening as he saw the relief in her face. "It's over now," he said, his voice calm. Aisha nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake smiled, his gaze shifting to the other bikers. "We're a family," he said simply. "We take care of our own." The crew loaded Aisha's mother onto one of the bikes, and they took off, the sound of their engines filling the desert night once again. But even as they sped towards safety, Jake knew the Serpents would be back. This was far from over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. I know you're wondering how this will all play out. After the battle with the Serpents, the bikers had made their way back to the outpost, the quiet of the desert night now broken only by the low hum of their engines. Aisha's mother was still unconscious, but the bikers had made sure she was stable. Aisha sat quietly behind Jake, her small hands clutching the back of his jacket. The ride had been long, and the events of the night were weighing heavily on her. But Jake knew the danger wasn't over. He could feel it. The Serpents might have been temporarily defeated, but they were far from finished. Jake's mind raced, his eyes scanning the horizon, watching for any sign of movement. The desert was vast and empty, but that didn't mean they were safe. The crew knew that, too. Every one of them was on edge, their senses sharp. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. As they rode, the night grew colder, the desert air biting at their faces. Jake glanced at the other bikers. Big Rick was keeping a steady pace behind him, his eyes constantly scanning the road. Phantom and Diesel were up ahead, staying alert. The crew was tight, moving like a well-oiled machine. But even with their skills and experience, Jake knew that the next move was on them. They had to make sure. Aisha's mother was safe, and they had to do it fast. The outpost they had been riding toward was still miles away, and time was running out. "We need to make it to the outpost before dawn," Jake said into his intercom, his voice steady. "Keep it tight." They pressed on, the sound of their engines reverberating through the silent desert. Aisha's grip on Jake's jacket tightened as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "What happens if they come after us again?" she asked, her voice small but full of concern. Jake glanced back at her, his face softening for a moment. "We fight back," he said simply. "We don't stop until your mom's safe." But deep down, Jake knew there was more at play than just a fight. The Serpents weren't the only threat. As they rode, Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to what they had discovered at the motel. Who was behind all of this, and why they were after Aisha's mother? There were too many unanswered questions. As the night wore on, the outpost finally appeared on the horizon, its lights glowing faintly in the distance. They were close now. Aisha's mother was still unconscious, and Aisha was still clinging to Jake's side, but the sight of the outpost brought a sense of hope. They were almost there, but as they neared the gates, something didn't feel right. Jake's instincts flared, and he signaled for the crew to slow down. He could see movement up ahead, shadows shifting in the distance. He wasn't sure who it was, but he knew they weren't alone. "Hold up," Jake ordered, his voice tense. "Something's wrong." The bikers immediately came to a halt, their engines cutting off one by one. The desert night was eerily silent now, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind. They sat still, waiting, their eyes trained on the area ahead. Jake scanned the landscape, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, 3 men, wearing dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They were standing just beyond the gates of the outpost, waiting. "Who are they?" Aisha whispered, her voice shaking. Jake's gaze hardened. "We're about to find out," he said. He slowly reached for his handlebar, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. The bikers were ready. They were prepared for whatever came next. "Keep your distance," Jake ordered, his eyes locked on the figures ahead. The men stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the bikers as they approached. There was a moment of silence, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then one of the men stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You're in the wrong place," he said. "This is our territory." Jake didn't flinch. "Not anymore," he said, his voice cold. "Now get out of the way." The man didn't move, but the look in his eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. These men weren't going to back down. It was clear that they were tied to the Serpents, and they were here to finish what had been started. "You don't belong here," the man said again, his voice laced with menace. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't just about a fight. It was about survival. "I'm not asking again," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "Move." The man stepped back, his hand going to his side, pulling out a gun. The bikers braced themselves, knowing this was it. Jake's heart raced. He wasn't about to let these men take them down, not when they were so close to safety. He stepped forward, his own gun now in hand. "If you want to fight, you've got one," Jake said. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the man raised his gun and fired. The sound of the shot shattered the silence of the desert. But Jake was already moving. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet as it whizzed past him. The crew didn't hesitate. The fight was on. "I know you're on the edge of your seat, wondering what happens next." The desert night erupted into chaos. The first gunshot rang out, breaking the silence like thunder. Jake dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that had been aimed straight at him. His heart pounded as he rolled to his feet, his eyes never leaving the men who had just tried to end it all. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The bikers moved quickly, reacting without hesitation. Big Rick pulled his own gun from the holster, his massive frame a force of nature as he swung around to face the attackers. The other bikers followed suit, pulling out their weapons and taking cover behind their bikes, ready for a fight. Jake didn't waste a second. His eyes locked on the man who had fired the shot, the one who seemed to be leading this ambush. With lightning speed, Jake moved into position, his gun raised. He fired 2 shots in quick succession. The first hit the ground just inches away from the man, the second grazing his shoulder, knocking the gun from his hand. The man cried out in pain, stumbling back. The bikers didn't hesitate. Phantom and Diesel moved in, their bikes roaring to life as they accelerated, closing the gap between them and the men standing at the gates. The attackers tried to regroup, but it was too late. The bikers were a coordinated force, like a swarm of locusts, fast, relentless, and overwhelming. One of the men attempted to raise his weapon again, but Big Rick was already there, his fist crashing into the man's face with a sickening thud. The man crumpled to the ground, knocked out cold. Jake kept his focus, his eyes scanning the battlefield. Another attacker tried to make a move, but Phantom was already on him, kicking his legs out from under him and pinning him to the ground. Jake turned his attention back to the man who had fired the shot. He was struggling to get up, clutching his shoulder. Jake walked toward him, his boots kicking up dust with every step. "You had your chance," Jake said, his voice low and cold. "Now you're done." The man groaned, looking up at Jake with fear in his eyes. Jake didn't hesitate. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at the man's head. The air was thick with tension, but before he could pull the trigger, a voice called out from behind him. "Jake, hold up." It was Big Rick, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. Jake turned to see Rick motioning for him to stop. The rest of the bikers had subdued the remaining attackers, but Rick was looking past them, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Jake followed Rick's gaze, his heart sinking as he saw what was coming. A cloud of dust was rising in the distance, and the unmistakable roar of more engines filled the air. The Serpents weren't done. Jake knew it the moment he saw the trucks and motorcycles speeding toward them. "Looks like we've got company," Rick said, his voice grim. "A big one this time." Jake's grip tightened on his gun. "We're not leaving without Aisha's mother. We take them down, right here, right now." The bikers gathered around, their eyes hard and determined. The last thing they needed was more trouble, but Jake wasn't about to run. He wasn't about to let these bastards take what they'd fought so hard for. The air grew thick with anticipation. The first truck was closing in fast, and the sound of more motorcycles filled the night air. "Ready up," Jake shouted. The bikers didn't need any more orders. They immediately moved into formation, their bikes revving up and ready for whatever was coming. The first truck pulled up, its massive tires kicking up sand as it came to a screeching halt just a few yards away. The headlights blazed, momentarily blinding everyone in their path. The doors of the truck flung open, and a group of heavily armed men stepped out, their faces covered with masks. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jake moved forward, his voice calm but firm. "We're not backing down," he said. "Get ready." The bikers didn't wait for the enemy to make a move. They charged forward, their bikes roaring to life as they hit full speed, swarming the attackers like a storm. The first shots rang out, the deafening noise of gunfire filling the air. Jake's mind was focused, his heart pounding as he raced toward the men, dodging bullets as they flew past him. The Serpents weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. As the bikers closed in on the attackers, it was clear that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice. A fight to protect the innocent, and a fight to show that the Thunder Riders would never back down. The battle raged on, but Jake and his crew were more than ready. They weren't going to let the Serpents win this time. They weren't going to let Aisha and her mother be taken from them again. The dust from the desert swirled around them as the fight continued, the roar of engines and the sounds of gunfire filling the air. This time the bikers were in control. This time, they were going to win. I know the stakes have never been higher. The battle with the Serpents was far from over, and with every passing moment, Jake and his crew could feel the pressure mounting. The sound of gunfire echoed through the desert, the roar of motorcycles drowning out the chaos. Jake's mind was racing as he maneuvered through the fight, his focus unshakable. The first wave of Serpents had been taken down, but they knew more were on their way. The second truck was now pulling up, its headlights blinding everyone in its path. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, dust, and sweat. Jake could see more masked men jumping out, their weapons drawn, ready to finish what they had started. The bikers didn't flinch. They knew what had to be done. "We hold our ground." Jake shouted over the noise, his voice steady. "No one gets through us." The bikers immediately took position, using their bikes as shields and drawing their weapons. Jake, the leader, was already moving, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness. Big Rick was by his side, the massive man blocking any incoming fire with his sheer presence. Phantom and Diesel worked together to take down the attackers who were getting too close. Aisha's mother, still unconscious, had been safely hidden behind one of the bikes, and Aisha remained close to Jake, her small form trembling but resolute. Jake had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. As the Serpents closed in, one of the attackers aimed his gun at Aisha. Jake didn't hesitate. With lightning speed, he drew his own weapon and fired, the bullet hitting the man's gun hand, sending the weapon flying out of his grasp. The man fell back, clutching his hand in pain. The bikers took advantage of the distraction, charging forward with renewed fury. The Serpents weren't backing down. They had come for blood, and they were prepared to fight for it. But Jake and his crew had something the Serpents didn't: unity. The bikers worked together, their movements synchronized, each man and woman watching each other's back. As one Serpent attempted to flank them, Phantom took him down with a swift kick to the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Diesel was next, using his bike to ram into another attacker, knocking him off his feet. The battle was fierce, but the bikers were relentless. They fought with the precision of soldiers, every move calculated, every strike designed to protect their own. But even with their skills, Jake could feel the heat of the battle. The second truck was still parked, and he knew it wasn't just a transport vehicle. It was a weapon, a tool the Serpents were using to bring in more men, more firepower. Jake turned to Big Rick, his face serious. "We need to take out that truck," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Big Rick nodded, his massive form already moving toward the truck, his eyes locked on the driver. Jake followed, his gun at the ready. As they approached the truck, the driver noticed them and immediately opened fire. The sound of gunshots rang out, but Jake and Big Rick were too fast. They took cover behind the nearest boulders, returning fire with precision. Big Rick's shots were dead on, the rounds piercing the truck's tires, causing it to lurch as it struggled to maintain momentum. The driver tried to steer it away, but it was clear that the truck was no longer a threat. Jake knew they had to finish this. He stood up from his cover, his gun raised, and took a final shot at the truck's engine. The truck's engine sputtered and died, and the vehicle came to a screeching halt, its tires skidding to a stop. The remaining Serpents were stunned, unable to process the loss of their primary escape vehicle. Jake's crew moved in quickly, taking down the rest of the attackers with swift, decisive action. One by one, the Serpents were subdued, their weapons knocked out of their hands, their bodies sprawled across the desert floor. The bikers didn't stop until the last man was down. They were tired, but they had won. The Serpents were no longer a threat. But Jake's heart still raced, his thoughts racing ahead. There was still work to be done. He turned to Aisha, who was standing by her mother, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "It's over," Jake said, his voice low and comforting. "Your mom's safe now." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. Jake gave her a small smile, a rare moment of softness in the midst of the chaos. "You're welcome," he said. "But don't thank me yet. We're not done." He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. There were still more questions to be answered, and Jake knew the Serpents wouldn't just let this go. This victory, while important, was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The bikers didn't let their guard down. They regrouped, keeping their eyes open for any more surprises. But for now, Aisha and her mother were safe. The desert might have been unforgiving, but tonight, it had given Jake and his crew the victory they had been fighting for. "I know the battle is over, but the tension is far from gone." Jake stood still for a moment, taking in the aftermath of the fight. The desert stretched out before him, vast and silent once again. The bikers were catching their breath, regrouping after the fierce battle. Their faces were hard, determined, but behind the tough exteriors, Jake could see the weariness. They had fought hard, but the war was far from over. Aisha's mother, still unconscious but stable, was being carefully tended to by Diesel and Phantom. The little girl sat next to her, her eyes wide, still processing the chaos she had just witnessed. Jake knew it was time to move on, but there were too many loose ends that needed tying up. The Serpents wouldn't stop after this. They were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice low and serious. The crew nodded in agreement, the reality of their situation settling in. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, not with the Serpents still gunning for them. The sooner they got Aisha's mother to safety, the better. But even as they prepared to leave, Jake's mind was racing. What were the Serpents after? Why had they targeted Aisha's mother? And who else was behind the gang? These questions kept haunting him, gnawing at him as the crew started their bikes and revved their engines. "We've got to move fast," Jake said, looking at the horizon. "Keep your eyes peeled for any sign of trouble." The bikers nodded, their eyes scanning the desert, alert to every sound, every shift in the wind. They knew better than to get comfortable. The desert was always watching, always waiting for the next storm to roll in. As they rode, Jake could feel the weight of the night pressing on him. He could still hear the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears, feel the heat of the battle still on his skin. But more than that, he could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Aisha. He had sworn to protect her, and he wasn't going to let her down. The road ahead was long, the miles stretching on endlessly. But Jake had been down this road before. He knew what it took to survive. And he knew that with his crew by his side, they could face whatever came next. They were a family, and nothing was going to tear them apart. As the desert landscape rolled by, Jake's thoughts kept turning back to the Serpents. The fight had been brutal, but it was only a glimpse of what was to come. Jake knew they would regroup, they would send more men, more firepower. But he was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The road felt endless, the only sound the rumbling of their engines as they pressed on. Aisha was still sitting quietly behind Jake, her small hands gripping the back of his jacket. She had been through so much already, and Jake could see the toll it had taken on her. But even in the midst of the chaos, he could see a spark of hope in her eyes. She had seen the strength of the bikers, the unity they shared, and she knew that as long as they were with her, she was safe. Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened as they approached a small town in the distance. The lights were faint, but it was a sign that they were getting closer to safety. But as they neared the outskirts of the town, Jake's instincts flared again. He could feel the danger approaching. Something wasn't right. He signaled for the crew to slow down, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the road ahead. There was a car parked on the side of the road, its engine running, its headlights off. It didn't take long for Jake to realize that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he motioned for the crew to stop. They pulled over to the side of the road, the sound of their engines fading as they came to a halt. The silence was deafening. Jake's mind raced, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of danger. He felt the weight of the moment. The serpents were still out there, and they had to be careful. Stay sharp, Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. The bikers dismounted, their eyes scanning the area, ready for whatever might come. They were on high alert now. Jake moved toward the car, his gun drawn, every muscle in his body tense and ready for action. The door of the car creaked open, and a figure stepped out. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. The figure wasn't armed. It was a woman, her face pale and worn, but there was something familiar about her. She stepped forward cautiously, her eyes meeting Jake's. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "They're after me too. I know who's behind the serpents." Jake's eyes narrowed as he studied the woman. She looked like she had been through hell, but there was something in her eyes that made him trust her. He lowered his gun slightly, but kept it ready. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low but commanding. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "My name is Sarah. I used to be a part of their organization. I know everything about them. And if you want to keep Aisha and her mother safe, you need to listen to me." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The serpents had been bad enough, but if this woman knew what he thought she did, things were about to get a lot worse. "I know you're waiting for the next chapter." The air around Jake and his crew grew heavy with the weight of Sarah's words. She had been part of the serpents, and now, she was offering them the information they desperately needed. Jake studied her carefully, his eyes narrowing as he processed the situation. His crew had already been through hell, and now, they were standing on the edge of something even more dangerous. Sarah looked exhausted, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes were sharp, filled with the kind of knowledge that could bring down an empire. "I'm listening," Jake said, his voice steady, but cautious. Sarah took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one else was nearby. The serpents have been expanding their operations for years. They're not just a gang anymore. They've infiltrated legitimate businesses, they have connections everywhere. But it's not just about money. It's about control. Control of the people, control of the city. Jake listened intently, his mind racing. This wasn't just another street gang. This was something far more insidious. The serpents were everywhere, and they had their claws in places Jake had never imagined. "So, what does this have to do with Aisha and her mother?" Jake asked. Sarah's gaze softened, and she hesitated before answering. Aisha's mother was once one of them. She was their top enforcer. She walked away when she realized what they were really doing. She started working against them, quietly. I don't know everything, but she knew too much, and they couldn't let her live after that. Jake's heart sank. It wasn't just a case of a woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Aisha's mother had been an insider, someone the serpents would go to extreme lengths to silence. Jake turned to look at Aisha, who had been quietly listening, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He could see the weight of the revelation hitting her. She had no idea her mother had been involved in something so dangerous, and now it was all coming back to haunt them. "Why are you telling us this?" Jake asked, his voice hard but with a hint of suspicion. Sarah met his gaze directly, her expression resolute. "Because you don't stand a chance without the right information. You're not dealing with a simple street gang. The serpents have been in control of this city for years. They've got powerful people backing them, people you don't want to mess with. If you want Aisha's mother to stay safe, you need to get ahead of them. I'm offering you a chance to stop them before they come after you again." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about a war. The serpents were entrenched, and taking them down wouldn't be as simple as knocking out a few low-level thugs. Jake turned back to his crew, his face hardening. "We can't just walk away from this. The stakes are too high. We're not going to let them control this city. We're going to fight." The bikers nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They had been through worse and come out stronger. They weren't backing down now. "So what do we do?" Rick asked, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Sarah. Sarah hesitated again, glancing at the ground before meeting his gaze. "There's a meeting tomorrow, a big one. All the major players in the city will be there. It's the perfect opportunity to strike. If you take out their leadership, you cut off their power." Jake's mind was already racing, plotting their next move. "How do we get in?" he asked. Sarah took another deep breath. "I can get you there. I still have some connections, people who trust me. But you have to move fast. Once they know you're coming, they'll have every resource at their disposal to stop you." The tension was palpable, But Jake could see the resolve in Sarah's eyes. She wasn't lying. She was offering them the only shot they had at taking down the Serpents before they regrouped and came after them harder than ever. "We'll be ready," Jake said, his voice low and determined. "We'll get Aisha's mother to safety, and then we'll take them down." The rest of the crew nodded, their faces hardening with determination. They had fought together for years, and they weren't about to stop now. Sarah turned to look at Aisha, her face softening. "I know this is a lot for you to take in," she said quietly, "but you need to understand something. Your mother was strong. She knew the risks, and she tried to protect you from them. She made her choice. Now, it's your turn to make yours." Aisha looked at Sarah, her eyes full of confusion and pain. "I don't understand," she whispered. Sarah knelt down to her level, her voice gentle but firm. "You're safer with these bikers than with anyone else. They're going to protect you, but you have to trust them." Aisha nodded slowly, her mind still processing everything that had happened. Jake could see the weight of it all on her shoulders, but he knew she was strong. She was going to be okay. He turned to the rest of the crew, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We move at dawn. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we take the fight to them." As the bikers prepared for what was to come, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Serpents were powerful, and they would do anything to protect their empire. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. "I know the air is thick with tension." The plan was set. Jake and his crew had been preparing for hours, each of them going through the motions, checking their weapons, tightening their grips on the handlebars of their bikes. It was the calm before the storm, but they all knew that when the time came, they'd have to move fast. Aisha's mother was stable, but they couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. The Serpents would be looking for them, and if they were going to strike, they needed to hit hard and fast. The hours before dawn passed like an eternity. The bikers, usually so focused and ready for action, were now oddly quiet, lost in their thoughts. Jake stood at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon, the city just visible in the distance. The meeting Sarah had told them about, the one where all the major players were gathering, was fast approaching, and the crew needed to be ready. Jake didn't doubt Sarah's loyalty, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. They were about to walk into the lion's den, and they needed a plan. "We don't have much time," Jake said, his voice steady. "We need to move, and we need to move now. Stick to the plan. We hit them hard and fast, then get out before they know what hit them." His crew nodded, the sense of unity in their eyes unshakable. They'd been through too much together to falter now. Jake glanced over at Aisha, who was standing off to the side, her eyes scanning the bikes, her small frame still looking fragile despite the strength she was beginning to show. He could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, but she had made up her mind. She was in this, just like the rest of them. "You ready?" Jake asked, his voice softening for a moment. Aisha nodded, her face hardening with determination. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I trust you. I trust all of you." Jake felt a small, rare smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "That's all I need to hear." With one last look around, Jake signaled for the bikers to get on their bikes. They revved their engines in unison, the sound deafening in the quiet desert morning. The plan was simple. Get to the meeting, infiltrate the Serpents' inner circle, and take down their leadership. It was risky, but it was the only chance they had. They sped through the desert, the engines roaring in the cool morning air. The city was getting closer. Jake could feel the tension building with each passing mile. As they reached the outskirts, the buildings and streets grew more dense. The air felt different, thicker, as if the weight of the city itself was pressing down on them. "Stay alert," Jake ordered, his voice sharp over the intercom. "We've got one shot at this." The bikers moved as one, expertly navigating the streets, their machines cutting through the traffic with precision. They didn't make a sound as they approached the meeting spot, a warehouse tucked in the corner of the industrial district. The doors were closed, but there was a small alley to the side. Jake signaled for the crew to park and dismount. They approached the warehouse on foot, their boots making no sound on the cracked concrete. Sarah had given them the location, but they didn't know what kind of security they would face once inside. Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. "No mistakes," he said, his voice firm. "We move in fast, neutralize the threats, and get the intel we need." As they reached the door, Jake motioned for Big Rick and Phantom to flank the sides. He took a deep breath before kicking the door open with a single, forceful motion. The room beyond was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. The serpents were gathered around a large table, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single, flickering light bulb. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. "This ends now," Jake said, his voice echoing through the room. The serpents froze, their eyes going wide as they saw the bikers standing at the door. The room went silent for a moment, the tension thick as the bikers stepped inside, their guns raised, their eyes scanning for threats. "You think you can take us down?" one of the men sneered, standing up from the table. He was tall, with a scar running down his face, and his eyes were full of malice. "We've been running this city for years. You're nothing but a bunch of punks on bikes." Jake didn't flinch. "We're not here to play," he said, his voice cold. "You've hurt enough people, and now it's time for you to pay." The fight broke out almost immediately. The bikers moved with precision, taking out the serpents one by one. Big Rick and Diesel charged forward, their fists crashing into the men who tried to fight back. Phantom was quick, taking down two of the serpents before they even had a chance to draw their weapons. But the serpents weren't going down without a fight. They pulled out guns, firing at the bikers, but Jake was too fast. He dove behind a crate, firing back with deadly accuracy. The room exploded into chaos. Gunshots rang out, ricocheting off the walls as the bikers took cover, moving in and out of the shadows. Jake could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he moved forward, taking out another attacker with a precise shot to the chest. But there were still more. The serpents had the numbers, and they were fighting like cornered animals. Jake had to keep moving, had to stay focused. The fight seemed to last forever, the noise deafening, the tension thick in the air. But as the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Jake looked around the room. The serpents were done. They had fought and won. But the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. I know the tension is still thick in the air. The warehouse is silent now, the sound of gunfire replaced by the steady breaths of Jake and his crew. The battle is over, but the cost of victory weighs heavily on their shoulders. The serpents are down, but they're not out. Jake can feel the cold reality setting in. This was just one fight in a war that's far from over. His crew is bruised, exhausted, but they've won. For now, at least. Aisha's mother is still unconscious, but safe. The bikers have their backs to the wall, surrounded by the wreckage of the Serpents' empire. Jake knows this victory, this brief moment of peace, is fleeting. They can't afford to stay here long. He turns to his crew, each of them breathing heavily, eyes alert, still on edge. "We need to get out of here before more show up," Jake says, his voice firm. "We head to the safe house. We'll regroup there and figure out our next move." The crew nods in agreement, their expressions grim. They've seen this before. This is what they do: fight, survive, and keep moving forward. Aisha's eyes are on them, a mixture of relief and fear still written across her face. She's been through hell, and Jake knows it's not over for her yet. The serpents may be down, but the truth about her mother's past will haunt her for a long time. "Aisha," Jake calls softly, his tone gentle but serious. "Stay close. I'm not letting anything happen to you or your mom." Aisha nods, though the fear in her eyes doesn't fully fade. She's trying to be brave, but Jake can see the weight of it all on her small shoulders. They've come this far, and there's still so much more ahead. As the bikers mount their bikes, the sound of engines roaring to life fills the air. They're ready to move, ready to get to the safe house, to regroup and plan their next move. But Jake knows that wherever they go, the serpents won't stop looking for them. They'll come for Aisha's mother again, and they'll come for all of them. The sun is starting to rise as the crew speeds down the highway, the city now far behind them. The landscape outside the desert stretches endlessly, an empty, barren wasteland, just like their future. The safe house is hours away, and Jake can't help but think of all the people he's lost, of all the things they've sacrificed just to get this far. But there's no time for reflection. The war isn't over. As they approach the turnoff to the safe house, Jake feels a pang of unease. Something isn't right. He signals for the crew to slow down, and they all fall into a tighter formation, their senses on high alert. Jake can feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There's movement up ahead, shadows darting between the trees. He raises his hand, signaling for the bikers to stop. Stay sharp, he warns. The bikers stop, their engines idling as they scan the area. The trees are still and silent, but something feels off. Do you see anything? Big Rick asks, his voice low, his eyes scanning the horizon. I don't like this, Jake mutters, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. The air is heavy, and the silence is deafening. Just then, a figure emerges from the trees, stepping into the road ahead of them. It's a man, his face hidden in the shadows. He stands tall, his posture confident, and he looks at the bikers with a cold, calculating gaze. Jake, the man says, his voice eerily calm. We've been waiting for you. Jake's heart skips a beat. He recognizes the voice. It's one of the Serpents' higher-ups, a man he thought was dead. What do you want? Jake demands, his voice sharp. The man steps forward, his hand slowly reaching into his coat. I'm here to offer you a deal, the man says, pulling out a small envelope and tossing it at Jake's feet. Take the envelope, and we'll let you go. But if you refuse, things are going to get much worse for you and your crew. Jake eyes the envelope, his instincts screaming that this is a trap. But he doesn't hesitate. He kicks the envelope aside, his gaze locking onto the man. We're not here for deals. We're here to finish this. The man laughs, a cold, humorless laugh. You think it's over? You think you can just walk away from this? No, Jake, it's far from over. We'll come for you again. And next time, you won't be so lucky. Jake's hand tightens around the handle of his gun. I don't care what you have planned. We're done with you. The man tilts his head, his expression unreadable. We'll see about that, he says before turning and disappearing into the trees. Jake watches him go, his heart pounding. The crew doesn't move until the man is completely out of sight. Then, without a word, they mount their bikes and continue down the road. The silence that follows is thick with uncertainty. They may have won today, but Jake knows the battle is far from over. The war has just begun. I know the end is near, but it's not the end they were hoping for. Jake and his crew had fought through hell to get here, but as the sun began to rise over the desert, the reality of what they had accomplished, or hadn't, settled in. They had faced down the Serpents, taken down their leaders, and fought tooth and nail for Aisha's safety. But Jake knew in his gut that the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The encounter with the man in the woods still gnawed at him. The deal he'd tried to offer, the threat that lingered, all of it pointed to a much bigger fight ahead. As the crew made their way toward the safe house, Jake's thoughts were a whirlwind. The bikes hummed steadily beneath them, the desert air rushing by, but his mind was elsewhere. Sarah's words echoed in his head. This isn't over. And she was right. As they pulled into the safe house, the crew dismounted, their movements slow but methodical. They had barely survived the night, and now they had to prepare for whatever was coming next. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. No one spoke as they went inside. Aisha and her mother were resting in one of the rooms, but even in the stillness of the safe house, Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. He knew they needed a plan, something concrete. He gathered his crew around the table. The Serpents are still out there. We've cut off the head, but they've got more tentacles, more power than we've even seen yet, Jake said, his voice steady but full of determination. We need to find out who's really behind this, who's pulling the strings. Big Rick nodded, his brow furrowed. We've taken down a lot, but it's clear there's more to this. We need to figure out who's funding them, who's enabling them. This isn't just about control of the city anymore. This is about something much bigger. Jake's eyes narrowed as he thought about Sarah. She had said the Serpents had their claws in every corner of the city, but she hadn't been able to explain fully. She had been a part of their operation, but how deep did that connection go? Who else was involved? As he looked around at his crew, Jake could see the same questions on their faces. But there was no time to waste. We need to keep moving. We can't sit here waiting for them to come for us, Jake said. We take the fight to them, wherever they are. We find out everything we can about their operations, their connections. We shut them down. Phantom stepped forward, his expression serious. We hit them hard. Strike at their weak points. But we need to make sure we have the intel first. We can't rush into another fight without knowing what we're up against. Jake nodded. You're right. We gather intel, find their sources, their backers. But we do it fast. Diesel, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We've got people in the city who know things. Maybe it's time to talk to them. They've been keeping an eye on the Serpents for a while. If anyone knows what's really going on, it's them. Jake thought about it for a moment, then made up his mind. All right, we reach out to our contacts. We'll get the information we need, but we're not waiting around for them to find us. We're taking this to them. The crew spent the next several hours strategizing, mapping out the city, pinpointing the places where the Serpents had influence. They weren't just a gang anymore. They were a network, a powerful force with its fingers in every pie. Jake knew that they were up against something much bigger than a typical gang war. This was about power, control, and corruption on a scale he had never seen before. As night fell, Jake stood outside the safe house, looking out over the desert. The stars were bright overhead, but they did little to ease the weight in his chest. Aisha and her mother were safe for now, but how long would that last? He had promised to protect them, and he was going to do whatever it took. We'll finish this, Jake muttered to himself. We'll finish what we started. But even as he said it, he knew that the hardest part of the fight was still ahead. The Serpents might have been knocked down, but they weren't out. And when they came back, they would be stronger. Jake had no illusions about what was coming. He had seen enough to know that the real fight wasn't just about taking down criminals. It was about taking down a system, a structure that ran deep in the heart of the city. The bikers weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for justice. And in that moment, Jake made a promise to himself. He would stop at nothing to bring down the Serpents, no matter who they were or how far they reached. They had made it this far, and now they had to see it through. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. In this gripping adventure, you'll dive deep into the world of Hell Angels stories, following the intense journey of Jake and his crew as they fight against the dangerous Serpents gang. Their battle for survival takes them through brutal confrontations, shifting alliances, and high-stakes action. As they work to protect a young girl and her mother from the sinister forces threatening them, you'll experience the adrenaline-pumping moments that define Hell Angels stories. From the first battle to the heart-pounding fight at the safe house, Jake and his crew face overwhelming odds and enemies determined to take them down. These Hell Angels stories show the loyalty, courage, and relentless drive of the bikers who won't stop until justice is served. With the Serpents closing in, the crew must make difficult choices and take on a far-reaching conspiracy that puts everyone they care about at risk. This chapter of Hell Angels stories captures the unbreakable bond between the bikers and the fierce battles they endure, all while protecting the innocent from harm. If you're a fan of intense, high-octane stories filled with danger, loyalty, and action, these Hell Angels stories are sure to keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned to find out what happens next as Jake and his crew gear up for the fight of their lives.